Hello and welcome to the Intentional Clinician Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Krauss, licensed professional counselor. In today's episode, I have a special guest. Tom Beakbane is back on the show. We are going to be discussing his book, How to Understand Everything, Consilience, A New Way to See the World. In addition to that, we are going to comment on the bottom-up versus top-down approach at looking at science in the world. We're going to be discussing the nervous system of mammals and other creatures. We're going to talk a little bit about Polyvagal Theory and trauma-informed counseling. We're going to discuss tribalism, anxiety, and the current emotional and political climate as well. It's going to be a rousing discussion, and we really hope you love it. A little bit about Tom Beakbane. He is the president of a brand marketing company in Toronto, Canada. With an honors degree in biochemistry and neurophysiology from Durham University in England, he was puzzled by the gap between textbooks' theories of human behavior and his experience creating business communications. He worked on closing that gap by tapping into developments at the frontiers of science, explained in his book, How to Understand Everything, Consilience, A New Way to See the World. Before we get to the interview, just a little bit about what I'm up to. I am now a fully approved EMDR International Association consultant, which means that if you are getting EMDR trained and want to become EMDR certified, I can help you in that process. More details can be found on my website. All right, let's get to the interview. Welcoming back to the podcast, Tom Beakbane. Welcome to the Intentional Clinician.
Hey, Paul. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And I know we had quite a few downloads of your last time you were on the show, episode 69, where we really talked about everything, but from the view of consilience, which is the subtitle of your book, How to Understand Everything, and consilience. So I know people have probably heard that episode. If they haven't, they should go listen to it. But perhaps we should just do a real quick recap of what is, in your words, consilience.
Okay. Consilience is a strange word because it hasn't been used much, and everyone imagines or tends to imagine that it's all about coming to agreement. But that's not the origin of the word. The origin of the word is from 1840. It was coined by a fellow called William Whewell. And it's a compound of the Latin word ciliens, which means to jump, and com, which means together. So it's the jumping together of ideas. And in my sort of way of thinking, it's that feeling that you get when you start to understand something, like two ideas like sort of gel. It's that moment. But I also use it in the sense that Edward O. Wilson used it. And he's a scientist who unfortunately passed away just a week or two back. He was a Harvard professor, an ecologist, a humanitarian, and a brilliant writer. And he wrote a book about consilience. And in his mind, consilience was going to happen when scientists figured out everything in the world, including how humans think and behave, and how to explain art from an evolutionary standpoint. And so I use consilience not exactly in the same way that he uses it, because I think that science isn't doing that and is not going to do that. In my way of thinking, consilience is the jumping together of lots of different disciplines. So it's not only the jumping together of physics and chemistry, because they've, in essence, they've merged, and they've merged with biology and genetics, but also they've sort of merged in with anthropology and archaeology. But I think that now we know enough about the workings of the human brain in a very matter-of-fact way that it enables us to understand how we move, how we talk, how we understand. And that means that we can start to figure out how science and art and religion and belief and on all of these different realms are sort of snapping together. There's no longer sort of clear delineation clear separation between all of these different disciplines. So consilience, in my way of thinking, is this remarkable time in history now when science is now meshing together with the humanities, and it's enabling us to understand, for instance, what's happening in the public realm currently, with this incredible tribalism we're seeing between red states and blue states, and vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, and all of these other things that are tearing us apart. Consilience is a moment in history that is enabling us to understand all of these things, in my view, more deeply than we've ever understood them before.
Well, thank you for that
it's a
reintroduction. It's
a bit of a mind cruncher there.
And we go really far into that and give a lot of examples in the first episode. And I wanted to, leave some mystery so people can read your book or get the audio version, which I've been enjoying. How to Understand Everything Consilience, a new way
to see the
world. Yes.
Yeah.
So essentially, I really liked, I did listen to one of your videos as well, which I think is probably from the book, about consciousness and how consciousness evolved in different single cell organisms and then different swimming organisms, and how it's kind of how sciences and different disciplines have shown that the evidence leads to more of a bottom up structure. And I wanted to have you comment a little bit on the bottom up, because I feel like this is a big point, that if this is missed, then the other topics we're going to get to, which we are going to talk about, anxiety, tribalism, we're going to talk about the pandemic and trauma and different things. But if we don't understand what a bottom up approach is, then we're sort of missing the some of the biggest points from your book and your viewpoints. So can you explain a little bit about the bottom up?
Sure. Before I talk about sort of bottom up in its sort of broadest meaning, I'll just explain this whole matter of consciousness, because thousands of books have been written about consciousness, and many of them deal with it as a sort of a quasi-mystical thing. In my book, I think I have like 3 or 4 paragraphs where I just explain, well, this is how consciousness evolved. There's no sort of deep and enduring mystery about consciousness from a biological and an evolutionary standpoint. I say just this is what people have discovered. But interestingly, I've never seen an explanation like mine anywhere else. And my explanation is based on trying to figure out how consciousness evolved, because if you look at the way all organisms have come about in the world, it's because some basic building blocks were created over 1 billion years ago. It's like every single one of our cells in our body is like a Lego block. Those Lego blocks evolved a long, long time ago. And there's unbelievable complexity that happens in each of those Lego blocks. And whether it's a single Lego block that's swimming around in a drop of pond water, or a collection of 20 trillion Lego blocks like ourselves, the basic Lego blocks aren't massively different one from another. So you've got a beautiful little dog that's going to make some noise in the background. I don't know how many Lego blocks it has, how many cells in its body. Who knows? Maybe 5 trillion. But those Lego blocks, the cells in its body, are not substantially different from the Lego blocks in ours. And we know that now from genetics and cell biology. It's not controversial because we can see that 99% of our genes are very similar to the genes of a chimpanzee. Now, that doesn't sort of take away from the sort of the majesty of life and the complexity of what we see around us. I'm not trying to sort of minimize everything and sort of sciencey it. But my point is that the consciousness is not something that is likely to have evolved recently. And by recently, I mean in the last 6 million years, since sort of early forms of humans started roaming around Africa. It's so complex and incredible that it wouldn't have happened recently. It would have happened sort of early on in the way those Lego blocks grow and work together. And so I just explain how, let's say, a little worm that's swimming around in the ocean 520 million years ago, which is when they sort of evolved, how the mechanisms actually came about, and how cells, the neurons, which are the nerves in the brain, sort of program themselves to point the worm in the right direction. And those basic mechanisms are no different from the mechanisms that are happening in our brain. And once you recognize that, you can explain consciousness. So sorry about becoming majorly sciencey on you. I guess what I'm trying to communicate is that this isn't a crazy sort of Tom Beakbane idea. It's just sort of putting the ideas together from a lot of different disciplines, genetics and cell biology and evolutionary biology and so on. But in terms of so the bottom up, let's take a look at the human body, for instance. The traditional way of looking at the human body is that it's a set of organs that sort of work together, much like a machine would work, with different circuits and relays and pneumatics. And the brain tells the body what to do. Well, once you realize that each of those Lego blocks is, if you like, looking after itself, the idea that one part of our body, the brain, takes control is untenable. Because, like, it would mean that, I don't know, all the cells, in your fingers and muscles are going to say, well, I sort of hand over my job to you, Mr. Brain or Mrs. Brain. And that absolutely doesn't happen. And we know it doesn't happen because of what we see, with plasticity, neuroplasticity, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. The brain is, and the neurons in the brain are constantly sort of reprogramming themselves. So, how this ties in with trauma and so on is that the old way of understanding the brain was that it was a sort of a modular computational device, a little bit like a computer, sort of instructing the muscles what to do. The new way of understanding the brain, that isn't frankly terribly well explained in neurophysiology textbooks, is that it's an organic system, and it's the whole neural system that happens like throughout the body that's sort of working. It's organic and present. Like, everything that we do is happening absolutely in the moment, from fraction of a second to fraction of a second. And so our traditional ways of understanding how the brain works really aren't correct. As simple as that. And so what I'm talking about are sort of ideas that have been expounded by sort of modern neurophysiologists like Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's wrote a book about emotions. Nothing's particularly crazy, but it completely changes the way this bottom-up idea completely changes the way one understands how the brain works, how we interact with each other, what communications is. I hope I haven't sort of dug in too deep here.
No, this is a good overview. So I would say that the reason the bottom-up approach is so important is it helps us understand not only human behavior, but mammal behavior and reptile behavior from a cell behavior. So if you go to my favorite little microorganisms called the tardigrades, who are often misunderstood because they do die, but they can survive the vacuum of space. And if you're online, you can Google these tardigrades, which look like little water bears.
You must be one of the few fans of tardigrades in the universe.
I might be, but I think it's going to start trending. So among my friends, we have somebody got a tardigrade mug off of Etsy, and it's handmade. And it's got tardigrades on it. It's pretty cool.
They're quite small, aren't they? Like
very small. They're about They're about the size of the tip of a pencil.
Okay.
And so you could see them with the naked eye, but it would possibly look like a speck of, pepper to you.
Yeah.
And they live all over the United States in trees and in moss and water droplets. And if you look at them, they look complicated. They look like a nice little bear. And these things can resist temperature changes, very extreme, from extreme heat to extreme cold. And they do all these interesting things. But the interesting thing about the tardigrade is that just like us, when it sees food, it goes forward. And when it senses a threat, it comes backwards. And anyone who's been around mammals long enough understands that that's a basic mammal behavior. Forward towards a source of food or pleasure, and backwards towards a threat. Yes. And what's happening, and what we understand a little bit from the Polyvagal theory that's coming out in the psychology world. I'm not sure who first did it, but who made it famous was Dr. Stephen Porges and Deb Dana. Yeah. Were the pioneers of bringing this into our field, was taking these things we know from science and the nervous system, and explaining them better, instead of this sort of like the brain is like this operator supposedly throwing signals down our arms and legs with the nervous system. No, the nervous system is completely reacting in tune all the time. So that's why I say people are like, well, my brain's up here and I should have thought more before this happened. And it's like, no, your body reacted in a different way. And it reacted in ventral vagal, which is from polyvagal, which is the safe response, which is rest and digest. It's when your autonomic nervous system is in the parasympathetic state. But if I sense danger, depending on the person and your personality, unlike the water bear, who will probably retreat, if my personality was more like maybe a mammal that's more aggressive, maybe a tiger or something. Not sure if they run away or fight. Not sure. It depends on the threat level, right? Yeah. I might either fight or flight as I get more aroused. I might get angry and yell at somebody, fight, or I might run away if I'm afraid, and also angry at the same time. And my sympathetic nervous system comes into play. Now, our nervous system is much more complicated than the tardigrade. Right. Yes. But the principles apply. And they've in the polyvagal theory, you can see if you go to the whole basic training, they'll take you through all the different animals and mammals and reptiles, and how the ventral vagal system went to the sympathetic system, went to the dorsal vagal system. And they'll explain. So if you get even more aroused or worried, you'll go into dorsal vagal, which is a life threat, hyper arousal, and you'll actually go into sort of freeze response if you're a more simple animal. Where you can experience all these collapse sort of symptoms like dissociation, numbness, depression, if you're a human. Other animals go into freeze as well, like, fainting goats. They'll just fall asleep. They faint, they fall over. People, why doesn't that squirrel get out of the road? It's just frozen. It's sitting there. And then I, accidentally run it over with my car. But also in freeze, in the trauma theory, we've also noticed that humans will do two other things, which is, one of the things that we call it fawn, because we like things that rhyme. So we've got fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flop. Of course, flop is collapse in the freeze mode, and the fawn is when you sort of try to adapt your behavior to for lack of a better word, your captors or your abusers. You sort of try to please people or please the tribe so that you aren't further harmed. Right? It's sort of like playing dead when you see a bear. Yeah. And so the reason I bring that up is because not only is polyvagal theory something people should check out, but it not only has the psychological components, which we can see through the different parts of the nervous system, it also has corresponding ways that when you're in these different states, affect digestion, blood pressure, heart rate, fuel storage, muscle tone, irritability, the way you hear voices, the way you don't hear voices, the way you process information. It's all interesting because we're much more complicated than the little tardigrade. Yeah. However, the principles are based on a bottom-up philosophy of that most humans, unbeknownst to them, have been told wrong their entire life, that they should have just thought about it more, that they should have made a plan, that their whatever their reaction is wrong, when in fact their nervous system has reacted, depending on the person,
yes,
to a circumstance before they even realized it. Then their brain, because of language was it's a later development and evolution, made up a story about why they did what they did. And that's where we get the personality. So let me give you one example real quick. Cool. So let's just say you're a worker and you're feeding your family, and you live paycheck to paycheck. And you go into your boss's office for a chat, and he says, or she says, I'm sorry, we're going to have to fire you immediately. And, you're gone today. Now, some people may, if they're having depending on the personality, having an authentic reaction, may scream and say, "How dare you? I'm screwed." Right. But we've been socialized in our society to have a polite exchange with this person who's firing us. Well, sir, yes. Could I get a cover? Get a letter of reference and these sort of things. So we're suppressing our natural nervous system reactions, though that same energy may come out later when this person goes home. They might experience all sorts of mental health symptoms, or they may try to find the nearest available thing to numb them, such as alcohol or marijuana. They might punch something. So what I guess we're trying to say is this top-down theory, and we can give examples of this, is coming from a scientific misunderstanding of the brain and the entire nervous system and the organism as a whole. And it comes possibly partly from mythology. I mean, you talk about that in your video, but maybe you can explain a little bit, because I don't know if I went too far down the polyvagal realm, trying to bring it in line with the bottom-up theory.
No, it meshes absolutely. I guess sort of my perspective is sort of comparing two contrasting ways of looking at the brain. And, when you get to the details, there's lots of room for fawns and flops and freezes and so on. I don't write about that or even know much about it, frankly. I do write about the startle response, how everything can happen within just a fraction of a second of you getting hit on the back of the head. I mean, there's just a remarkable cascade of complex reactions that happen way faster than our conscious brain can think. But my way of sort of coming at it is to contrast the typical academic way of viewing sort of consciousness and behavior as the brain has evolved. The triune brain. We had the reptile brain, and then the mammal brain, and then the human brain with the consciousness on top that controls behavior. I mean, that has been completely discredited by neuroanatomists and evolutionary biologists. It doesn't stand up at all. But this whole idea that sort of you learn behavior at school by looking at books and sort of learning how to reason, and there's a type 1 way of reacting, which is quick, and then sort of type 2, which is more reasoned. I mean, that whole way of looking at the development of people and young people has been discredited, in my view. The way I look at it is that our brains are still working in many of the same ways, actually almost completely in the same ways as a tardigrade's brain. But there's just added layers of complexity on top of that. And our brain it's what's called goal directed. Like everything that we do is sort of like moving us, somewhere that's good, like socially or in terms of status or whatever's important at that particular moment. But our brain is operating absolutely in the moment, and that's not what most sort of academics acknowledge. They think, oh, okay, you sort of think things out and then make decisions. Absolutely not. We are, like right now, we're in a conversation. We are acutely sensitive to what each other's saying. And if you just change your tenor, I can see you on the Zoom call. If you start looking angry, I'm going to change what I do. And that's going to be something that happens even before I think about it. Because because we're absolutely in tune with everything that's happening around us. And if something strange happens out of the corner of our eye, we react far, far faster than we could ever think. And my contention is that nearly all of human behavior is subconscious, nearly all of it. And the most remarkable things about the human brain are the things that we aren't even aware that our brain is doing, like sort of organizing what we're seeing into sort of the different categories of things that we see around us. So we are completely in line with each other in sort of the Consilience way of understanding the human brain is absolutely in line with your polyvagal theory. I don't know, frankly, about the details of the polyvagal theory, and that there are probably some parts that I could pick holes in if I put my mind to it. But the notion that the body is a partner in our behavior is absolutely in line with the way I think about the human behavior. Everything that's happening in our muscles, everything that's happening in our skin, our heart, our gut, and so on. All of that is affecting how we're behaving from moment to moment.
Yes, exactly. That is very much in line with the way the polyvagal theory and the trauma-informed theory sees things. We see it as humans adapting to their environment, which is why when you said about young people learning, from what I've learned from psychology and where our field has been going, and it's drifted far away from this top-down approach. Our field is luckily going more towards a bottom-up way of looking at things. Mm-hmm. Young people learn by imitation, and they learn by environment, and they learn by adapting to their circumstances. They do not learn primarily from textbooks or from the 10 Commandments or from rules or from this. They learn by breaking rules. They learn by making mistakes. And so an easy example is in psychology, in counseling world, you'll get parents coming in saying, my kid isn't following these 5 rules. They're not doing this. They're not doing that. And I'm sick of it. And I need you, therapists, to fix it. And then we say, we can't. I mean, we could bring you in for family therapy, and we can work with you all and as a family. And they say, are you serious? This is not my issue. This is my child not compliant. I've taught them all these things. So what you've done in a sense is been Charlie Brown's parents barking orders at them, but they don't care what you say. They care what you do. Now they care what you say if you're going to take away their phone or their toys or their whatever, but the children learn by what you do in your life. And so if you are barking all of this, I don't know, this is a fun one to pick on. I am a dad who believes in personal responsibility. And then they see you shirk your own personal responsibility when it comes to maybe your partner or your car maintenance or your bills. What do you think they're going to do? They're going to do what you do, not what you told them to do. And it's a big difficult thing for parents to deal with because a lot of them haven't considered how their behavior or how they cope with things would be what the children are picking up on. But that's exactly what they're picking up on. Every moment is teaching a child, especially when you're a little baby and a little child. Every moment is absorbing information. They're absorbing their environment. And so therefore, and I'm not saying they can't make choices, and I'm not saying that their mind doesn't come up with little schemes and misbehaving and this and that, and that we don't have autonomy. But for the most part, children are sponges. And what you said about subconscious, a lot of our behavior until we get to be old enough and we can start examining and contemplating why we did what we did, usually afterwards, is subconscious. In fact, Carl Jung, whose work could be exalted or burned depending on where you're at, but I think it covers the gamut of a lot of fun things. He said one of the major tasks of the human soul is to make the unconscious conscious. And if you could figure out reasons and answers as to your unconscious behaviors and thoughts and say them or put them out there, you would then have a healing effect because you would I think, I don't know, not make up a weird story. Like you get the real reason, where normally humans are making up stories about things. So anyway, that was my little comment on.
If I could just add to that, I think when people think about communication, they think in terms of words, written words and the words that are stated or said. There's a lack of appreciation that way more communication happens sort of physically with just body movements, the way our eyes are moving, what we're looking at, what we're worried about, how we, our gait and aspects of how we interact that most people are not aware of at all. Like a trained actor tends to get sort of tuned to those things. And I know when I was raising my kids, I mean, I've got two girls and they're 32 and 30 years old. So they're well beyond this. But when they were little, when they were babies, I was a very affectionate dad. I was always like throwing them in the air and giving them hugs. But I sort of made a point of always talking to them as adults. So I would never go into baby talk, just so they could get used to that. But more than that, I would try and teach them that words themselves aren't terribly important. It's the sentiments behind the words. So I would call them bad little monkeys or something like that, or bad monkey rap. But I would always then give them a warm hug and sort of bury my mouth in their neck. So they could always tell that it wasn't my words that were important; it was my behavior. And I believe that one of the reasons I enjoyed being a dad so much was because we used to do so many things together. Just physical things like going for walks and what have you. And I never made a point of sort of lecturing them. Anyway, that's just, I guess, how my sort of perspectives sort of bled over into the way I raise my kids. And unfortunately, they're not too psychotic at all now.
Well, that's good evidence right there, anecdotal. But I mean, that is in line exactly with what Dr. Dan Siegel has been preaching and what Dr. Bruce Perry has been saying. And actually, Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah just wrote a book together, which is interesting, called What Happened to You? And then there's a subtitle about trauma or something like that. But essentially, it's how the medical model used to say, what's wrong with you? Sort of in a shaming way when somebody would come in with a behavior or an addiction or they're overweight, instead of saying, what happened to you that caused you to have this adaptive reaction, which then became a constricting negative behavior. Right. So with what was once useful is now constricting if you don't adapt further. So for instance, an easy one here would be, I wanted to bring up, I'm going to give you an example of, let's say, a father who didn't have a good affection behind his actions. And all he did was yell at his daughters and say, oh, you're too, you're looking overweight and you aren't good enough at tennis, right? Right there. They take you seriously because as a child, you're basically God to your child. They don't know the world outside of your microcosm of a family. Yeah. And so one of them might say, well, I really should eat less because I need to, be skinny and I need to work more hard at tennis. And they start doing these behaviors, which become overcompensant. I can't say it, but they overcompensate.
Compensatory, yeah, okay.
That's too long of a word. They overcompensate, and then years later they're still having trouble, and that comes from the nervous system because of the meaning they meant with that. They wanted to please their father. So what you did a good job of, from what you're telling me, is what's called co-regulation, and this is one of the major tenets of polyvagal theory when it's applied to psychology and applied to teaching parents how to have better behaved children, that they get along and like each other. It's called co-regulation. It's all about regulating my nervous system so that the younger person, or if I'm a therapist, the person in mental distress across from me can feel my presence and feel the way that I talk to them and the tenor and the gentleness and the approach and the acceptance and the actual listening. And for patients, that is what's part of what heals them, besides the techniques we teach, because they have to trust us on a deep level, which is difficult if you've been wounded by your family or others. And for children, they have to be trusting us to want to please us and to want to learn and to want to grow. And so what you were doing was called, what we would call co-regulation, because when your child is young, their nervous system is your nervous system. They cannot regulate themselves. They don't know when, people, I could go far and far into parenting.
I hear you.
Yeah.
In my terminology, sort of a word would be, I presume when you're with a patient or when one is interacting with a child, as a parent or a teacher, that word is engagement. What you have to show that you care, and just by sort of the act of listening and looking as though you're listening and making it clear that you care, that in itself sort of facilitates healing and therapy and good development, doesn't it? That's my way of thinking.
Absolutely. And, I think this may be a segue into some of the things you want to talk about. I just want to make sure for the listener, we understand that the top-down way of looking at things is coming from, I don't know, when was this popular? What would you say?
Well, I think it's had a very long genesis, and it sort of comes from the ancient Greeks. Not to blame Aristotle too much, but the whole idea that the world was ruled by a sort of a mover in the heavens, and that there was a sort of a hierarchy of existence, the scala naturae. That was where it originated, but it's become sort of locked in as a central ideology and dogma in academia recently, because there's this idea that the brain actually handles information, and that the brain is like a computer, and that the way you teach people is by sort of shoveling this stuff called information into that brain, and that sort of leads people to become successful and intelligent, once they sort of process it with their internal microprocessors. So the current ways of thinking about the brain, this sort of top-down way, it's become predominant in particularly academic society. It's sort of a blue state way of thinking, which sort of tends to sideline traditional spiritual ways of looking at the world, to make it somewhat political. So this top-down way of conceptualizing behavior, the brain, the way the world is organized, with a prime mover in the sky sort of ruling the world through the laws of physics, is something that's been around a long time, but it's actually become even more extreme over the last 20 or 30 years since the dawn of sort of widespread microprocessors and computing, and that's why I think folk like yourself need to fight back against that way of thinking, because it's not how the brain works. It's not how human behavior comes about, and so it's probably becoming even harder for you to sort of practice when the prevailing dogma is, well, it's all about information and answering multiple choice questions and making sure that you pass your exams and getting a credential and sitting in front of a computer. That's unfortunately not our biology.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that. I want to make a few comments because there's a big fight in my field about this very topics. For instance,
okay.
I don't mind cognitive behavioral therapy. It was one of the predominant forms of therapy that kind of started our field, and it does work to a point, but it works on how you do it. And that's what we've learned from all the research and counseling. It matters how you do it and the way the person brings it. It's called the common factors. And literally, this is hilarious, but a lot of cognitive behavioral therapists still to this day if they're certified, will say, the brain's like a computer, and then they'll give all these examples. And that's just correct. Yes. And I disagree completely.
It's not a good starting point.
No, it's a bad starting point. And it's not like a computer. The only thing, and so it starts with a bad paradigm. And so that's why the trauma-informed model, and I shouldn't even call it trauma-informed, it should be neuroscience-informed, whatever we start learning more and more informed trauma or informed therapy. And that's what we're trying to do is we have to basically teach people to unlearn or deprogram from multiple ideas, one of which is it's a top down, and that helps because that hurts people's self-esteem. I must be a loser because I did this wrong, and I couldn't think to be economically successful in this way, so I must be a lesser than being. So that is, first of all, affects us majorly. And secondly, the same thing with teachers and parents, which is, and this reminds me of this quote that's probably attributed to this Confucian philosopher from the 3rd century, which is, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And I bring that quote up because what we're trying to do with the new types of therapy I'm doing, and just the paradigm is to involve people. Right? We don't just lecture them and say, well, in cognitive behavioral therapy, you have these cognitive distortions. See, Tom, when you're scared of that tree that you're passing by when you're driving, that's because your brain is malfunctioning. It's not malfunctioning. It is adapting to the fact that you almost hit a tree once, and now it's seeing that tree as a stimuli. And it's not just your eyes that are seeing it. Your entire nervous system is seeing it. It's lighting up in some sort of, if I could use the metaphor of holiday lights, it lights up a certain pattern in your body when you see that tree, and it's actually adapting to help you, and it's giving you physical and palpable anxiety and intrusive thoughts about being wrapped around that tree in your car. And that is actually good, Tom. And let me explain to you why that's good. It's your brain trying to protect you. Now I have to give you coping skills to help you turn the volume down so you can drive amongst the trees in the forest. Instead of, my God, you're thinking of that all wrong, here's these exercises to start beating this out of your head in, cognitive behavioral boot camp. Now, I'm not saying, I'm going to get emails from cognitive behavioral therapists. I'm not saying that that's what you say, but I'm saying that is how people in our culture have taken cognitive behavioral therapy and used it to not only shame people into that their nervous system reactions are wrong and bad, but also, and this is where it really gets my goat, is that somehow the therapist is superior to the client because they know this information and they are bringing this top-down methodology to the therapy room, which is why if you've had a bad experience in therapy, that's probably what happened to you. The therapist thinks they're high and mighty because they got a master's degree. Instead of seeing you as an equal partner that they will involve in not just teach, because teaching's a part of it, because you have to help the paradigm orient, because it's a deprogramming from the modern, and I don't mean just the education system, because there's plenty of good things about the education system too. I mean our cultural education system. What you see on television, what you read on the internet, what is important to what gets clicks, controversy, divorce, chaos. So essentially,
well, don't get me going on the arrogance of experts.
Okay, we won't go too far.
I'll get into trouble. I mean, I love experts sort of as individuals, but particularly when you're going one-on-one like we are now. Yeah. But when you put experts into groups, they develop groupthink worse than anyone, and along with that groupthink goes sort of arrogance, and it takes one to very bad places. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing right now on many things that are happening in the public realm. That people who imagine that they know better for kids and how to raise kids, and I think that anyone who sort of applies simplistic theories to something as sort of complex and rich as educating a child has a broken understanding of the complexities of everything, knowledge and science, and I could go on and get myself into trouble.
Well, Yeah, well, I think this is a good segue, though, because I think we've now talked about bottom up and why that's important and why it brings us into a way of learning and experiencing the world that can be more involved and can be, isn't so mythical. And then we're kind of going towards what was top down. And you just kind of named some top down things, which is if a bunch of experts get together, they can't read the room, so to speak, come up with something and then throw it at the other people without having maybe tested it out fully among, what is the reaction going to be and got some feedback. So I think that might lead a little bit into the discussion we were going to chat about. And I'm not sure if this is too soon, but my brain's making the connection about the current state of high levels of anxiety and depression, which is in the news every day due to the ongoing pandemic and tribalism. So you had some comments on that. So is that a good way to go now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge subject, and I always like using examples and even triggering examples, just because it helps illustrate the point. I've spent a career in marketing. Okay, so. I've been working for very big, successful companies, thinking up ideas that are designed to change people's minds about products and services and so on. And I think it's fair to say I've had a very successful career running an agency. And so I've become very attuned to the tricks that are used in my industry, and they're used in marketing products as well as in politics. And I've become attuned to the power of words and how a word can become a symbol that has immediate effects on people. And I like to think about things from what sort of way up high, to use that metaphor. It's a bit unfortunate that I'm using that metaphor. I like to disassociate myself from the actual words themselves and say, like, what is happening in someone's brain when we hear a word? And let's just pick a highly contentious couple of words right now, if you don't mind, which is Jan 6. Jan 6.
Oh, yes, January 6th, yes.
January 6th, okay. So to people in North America, who are sort of left-leaning Democrats, Jan 6 is representative of a threat to democracy. That's when some people, largely in fancy dress, sort of, quote, broke into the Senate, I think it was.
They broke into the Capitol building, yes.
Capitol building, that's right. Shows my ignorance of American politics.
It's okay. I think the Senate building is in the Capitol building. Yes.
There you go. To right-leaning people, it wasn't that at all. It wasn't an insurrection. It was a bunch of people sort of wanting to basically express themselves and sort of demonstrate, the same as many other people have demonstrated through history. And according to Senator Cruz, it was probably sort of inflamed somewhat by CIA or other operatives. So there's two massively different ways of looking at this. But when you start talking about Jan 6 to anyone in America, or most people in America, it has an instant effect on them. That was evil, or it wasn't evil. It was just people sort of expressing themselves. And it's like your tardigrade. It's an instant response to just a couple of words, and so those words have become what I call tribal banners. Okay, and we gather together into our tribe, particularly when there's a perceived threat, like a threat to our families, our children, our parents, the people around us. When there's that fear, it triggers those same instincts that cause us to look after children, and that you see throughout the mammalian world. You see it with your dog when it has a pup. It will lash out to anyone that threatens that pup. So those same mechanisms are happening in the human brain, but they're happening deep down. And I think one can understand a lot about what's happening to populations and how, honestly, we're being manipulated very often by political forces on one side or the other to be fearful and to sort of collect together into opposing tribes. And I think it's helpful for everyone to have a deeper understanding, like a more honest understanding of our own biology and everyone's biology, because it helps sort of quieten one down, so that when you hear a word that's triggering, you start to listen and say, well, what do you actually mean when you use those words? And I think we would get along better with each other if people reacted like that more often, and instinctively, instead of saying, well, do you believe in that? Do you believe it was an insurrection or not? You say, well, actually, what precise? How did you arrive at your emotional response to those particular words? And I would presume that meshes together with what you sometimes try and achieve with, your therapies.
Yeah, I would say that, in the therapy, a lot of depression and anxiety, I'm just going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say some anxiety and depression come from a hyper focus of something. So for instance, for some people, and I'm being very grossly generalistic, so, no emails, please. It's just a general thing I see. We see people hyper focused on something, right? And then their mind kind of focuses based on their personality or any sort of other things in their life, such as maybe a more rational approach or maybe a more emotional approach. One or the other normally. They'll pick on one of, either rationally looking at something and hyper focusing, and it makes them have irritation, frustration, anger, fear, depression, these sort of things, because usually it's something outside of their control. And then on the same level, sometimes we see somebody taking a very emotional, on the other side, an emotional response to something. And it just is irking them, and they can't seem to see the other side. So the rational person doesn't know what their emotions are doing, and that's causing them massive issues. And the overly emotional person reacting to the stimuli, this hyper focus, can't see the rational side, and that's causing them to be imbalanced. And in one of our therapies, we try to do an exercise where we try to have you be aware of both parts, and not that there's only two parts of your mind, but just metaphorically, your rational and your emotional sides, and try to find a balance when looking at the same stimuli. Can we look as if we're a third person looking down from a balloon or a drone at ourselves, and say, can we imagine what the emotional side of us is saying? What is the rational side of us saying? What is the fearful side? And then we can break it down further. I mean, there's different parts. What is our self that's fearful? What is that like? It reminds me when I'm 16 and I was trapped in a car, or it reminds me of when I was in college and I was so angry at this one professor. It brings us to different moments in our life, which may explode our reaction toward something or the other. And so that being said, I think you were saying, like, words can become focal points. What was the word you used?
Tribal banners. I mean, certain words become representative of a particular group.
Correct. And so the more that people in political parties understand how to use fear, and fear is the great driver. In fact, there are some Buddhist sayings, that, of course, not in English, but they've been translated to say the biggest part of human suffering is fear, greed, and the ignorance of your full humanity. The ignorance of not understanding who you are and where you are in the universe. I mean, that's a spiritual belief, but I see that because if I'm a person who likes to hear from both sides. I don't like to to go off of one tribe or the other. But if you say a trigger word, like you said, January 6th, what you're going to hear is two vastly different ideas, but both are based in fear and both often have anger. And both believe that the other one is taking away their rights or taking away their way of life, or or is involved in some super secret plot to oppress everyone. But oddly enough, they both say that in different ways.
Yes.
Right. And we could explain how, but that would be getting into the meat of it more.
What's unfortunate is that if you even talk about some of these things, it shows that you're not sort of embracing one tribe or the other, which means that you're not part of that tribe. So even talking about, who knows, democracy or capitalism or Jan 6th or Trump vaccines, or whatever it is, as soon as you start talking about that person, your audience member, tries to pick up on which tribe you're part of. And if it's clear that you're sort of hovering above the whole thing and you're not actually sort of fully embracing their way of looking at the world, it means that they instantly become suspicious of you, which is deeply unfortunate. And I think we've got to train ourselves to talk about these things without being judgmental. And we've got to recognize when we're being played by one side or the other.
Yes, I agree. I think, when you say being played, I think part of that is an organization that exists is sort of, I know this is funny, but it sort of becomes an organization almost becomes an organism. It wants to survive. It wants to live. And so it will do whatever it takes to adapt to the climate. And that's right. And so I've seen, that's a theory I have, but I feel like when you say being played, I think it's that they keep testing out what is going to get more people to join their organization and what is going to keep more people from atrophying away from their organization, what is going to keep money coming in and what is going to keep lawsuits away. And so therefore, one of the easiest ways is to say, join our tribe because the other tribe's trying to destroy your life, your way of life and everything about it. And that's where it's escalated in America, is that the two political parties that are dominant literally say, if the other one gets elected, everything's going to be ruined for you.
Yeah.
Your children are ruined. Your rights are ruined. This is ruined. And it depends what rights you're talking about, because both have like little issues they like to poke, even though they never do much about either of them when they're actually in office. But it's actually getting a little scary because then you're right. Like there is no conversation. For instance, I like a lot of natural approaches to living natural. See, I'm saying natural. See, that's a key word right there, isn't that?
That's a triggering word.
It's a triggering word, but on the same level. So I have a Eastern practitioner I work with for my health, and I have a Western practitioner I work with for my health. Why? Because they both have really great things to contribute, and they both have different paradigms, but neither of them says don't see the other one. They just say, let us know if the other one's giving you something, so I know not to mesh with those two with the ingredients. And so I find that rare. For instance, the whole vaccine thing. We could go on for that forever and research and blah, 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 and everyone's viewpoints. Yeah. But for me, it was more like, what's my calculated risk? I understand this vaccine it could be risky, but so could contracting the disease. So what am I going to do about that? Right. That's how I kind of took it. And and until, I don't know, 10 or 20 years of longitudinal studies on the vaccine and also longitudinal studies on the people that got COVID and didn't have the vaccine are analyzed, we won't really know the real answer. It was a risk. And so I think there's a lot of anger, a lot of, what's that called? Immediate character judgments on both sides. Anxiety and anxiety, right. And the judgment is coming from the anxiety, because if you're anxious and then you meet somebody who doesn't take your worldview, you automatically assume I need to defend myself against you, instead of I want to know why you don't have the same viewpoint I have, and maybe we could discuss that, right?
Yeah, I mean, the whole vaccine matter is a fascinating case study in mass psychology, marketing, organizations, And let's talk a little bit about sort of conspiracy theories and why, on the whole, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. Like, on the whole, I mean, there are conspiracies, of course,
Sure,
and evil people. But the way I look at the behavior of people is that, we love being part of organizations. We cannot exist sort of outside of various social groupings. I mean, we are absolutely social animals. We just literally would die without others. And so when you get sort of groups of physicians or regulators or politicians in a particular party, they tend to fall in line with a particular goal or ideology, and that can evolve from. And if you look at it from a bottom-up standpoint, it evolves from all of the collective behaviors of every individual, sort of operating from day to day and minute to minute, and it leads to a crystallization of belief that can be generally sort of summed up in a very simple vision or objective and a couple of key words. It might be like public safety, let's say, or health for everyone. But the I mean, let's say with vaccines, what really needs to happen is that everyone is treated as an individual. A child, depending on sort of their health and conditions, should be treated according to their individual circumstances. And unfortunately, when sort of organizations take over, everyone gets put into the same box, and so everyone has to have the same therapy, 2 weeks apart or whatever it is, and that, in my view, is very often counterproductive. You've got to treat the individual. You've got to understand, and you've got to understand how people develop the ways of thinking and the protocols that they have, and I'm very suspicious of big anything. Big government, big tech, big pharma, big marketing, big company, whatever. Let's listen to experts, as individuals, and evaluate their ideas based on their experience and their merits. And let's be highly suspicious of groupthink, because groupthink can very often crystallize in ways that are not good for the individual. And looking at the world from the bottom up, if every individual is healthy and productive and feels good about their role and their ability to look after themselves, then society works fantastically. If you've got large groups of people who don't feel that, it's going to implode at some point. and we're heading towards implosion point, unfortunately.
Yes, it would be wonderful if people could all feel good in their role. I mean, I think that is the role of, if we, how do I say this? It's the role of what they called the polis in the Greek, which was that's where the word politics comes from, which is the people coming together and having opinions and trying to make something. So the hard part about our society right now, as you said, we're heading towards a breaking point. I think I don't see it as a breaking point. I see it as an entropy point. I think certain areas of our society are facing very boring and small breakdowns in, de-evolution, if you will, because of very complex factors. And because we do need people and who knows, maybe the pandemic is a breaking point. I don't know, but that's exposing the entropy. But we do want people to feel good in their role. We want people to feel that they have, a place to have a healthy family. And that, what we've been seeing with the pandemic is that we need to be, as a society, I think in North America, we need to be thinking about our mental health and how that affects everything. I mean, there's already a host of studies on how having decent mental health can contribute to positive physical health and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But one thing you were talking about with conspiracy theories and this sort of the groupthink, the reason I don't believe in conspiracy theories, I do believe in people doing dirty tricks, like you said, and manipulating. But the problem with conspiracy theories for me is that it provides a simple, overarching answer that is completely reductionistic and almost black and white in the way.
Yes.
It's almost. Remember the villains from James Bond and Batman and these old comic books, and they're just
for sure.
They sometimes are sophisticated in that they have like a reason why they became evil, but normally they're just like, I'm evil. Anything that's evil, I'm good with. Anything that is good, I'm bad with. I don't like anything good, and that is when I hear these conspiracy theories, and I've read some of them. My God, I'm like, okay, yeah, okay, yes, good point. Corruption, money, yes, okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, wait a minute. Everything else, everything, it's too black and white. It's too simple. It allows people to have, this is my theory, it allows people to have a place to put their anxious energy. Yes. I now know the answer. I feel better. I feel like I have meaning, because one of the most difficult things about becoming an adult, and this is what we see in a lot of people that come in for therapy, not for just depression, but for other things, is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. And a lot of times as an adult, when you start really having abstract thought, which happens to most of us, and you live in a society which is so complicated, and there's economic factors and, education factors and government edicts and, different messages. And now we have access to this on the internet day and night. We can watch videos where people explain things. This is my favorite. There's a subgenre of videos where people are reacting to other people's videos that are explaining the news. So we have the news, somebody explains the news, and then you have somebody reacting to that video. It's just like, if you don't have a good contextual understanding of how information is spread and works, you're going to be so confused at all of this. And so conspiracy theories to me are too reductionistic, although, they always have a point of truth or a point of that seems true. And so I think one of the most difficult things is, and this goes to the bottom up, is that in a world where there's so many people trying to be the top dog, so to speak, and top downing everything. Hey, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm an expert on this. Hey, the White House has their own YouTube channel. Hey, Joe Rogan's got his own podcast, but he's kicked out of YouTube. And hey, this podcast hates Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan hates this podcast, and Tom Beakbane's book is over here, and this other guy's got this book. And there's so much information, and I don't mean it's a good thing, but your average consumer
they're overwhelmed. It's completely overwhelming.
It's overwhelming. And for me, I grew up, the internet wasn't in my life until I was in my early 20s. So I was able to evolve in the land before I had too much information. And I feel like that one of the tasks of our age is to be able to tolerate ambiguity and tolerate and understand that there's lots of different viewpoints. All may have some valid points to them, and to be able to take that information and not immediately have our nervous system go into polyvagal fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, and be able to contemplate what is the best path of action based on where I am and what are my circumstances and what is my community around me. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen during the pandemic is that, at least in the United States, we aren't too good at that. And
in the Western world, it's not just the United States. Well, oh my gosh!
I'm just speaking for me, because I don't want to. I have a few friends in Canada, and they're telling me how things.
Well,
are
we're
slightly
crazy in Canada. I think it's even worse in Australia.
Okay. So, the tolerating ambiguity is just, it's not there. It's immediate, like you said, it's jumping to a tribal banner, or people are having total meltdowns, mental breakdowns. Everything I know is wrong. And I'm telling you, and I'm so glad that people are reaching out for mental health help. I hope it's good help, but we're getting more calls than ever. That's documented all over. So to say, I don't know what I mean by that is we need a bottom-up approach. We need people to be able to say, I'm an individual. I have the right to learn from many different sources, and I need to figure out how to be a human, of a human being in my environment, so that I don't just become a human consumer. And a human consumer, and I'm being a completely hyperbolic, so just go with it for a second. But just where I'm consuming all this information, but I don't know what to do with it. So I'm now paralyzed. I'm angry, or I'm, afraid all the time. I'm paralyzed. I don't do anything. I don't vote. I don't get involved in local politics. I don't try to make my world a better place. I'm angry, so then I go attack people that I think are making my world a worse place, or I'm afraid of everybody, and I'm, giving money. So we're not in this sort of, according to polyvagal theory, we're not in the lowest, in the green pattern, where we're in a community, we're exchanging ideas, we're having these discussions, we're tolerating that many people have different perspectives about what should be done. We're getting into a world that is more, I guess, on fire, that people's nervous systems are on fire. And what you're going to, and what you said is a melting point, a breaking point. I said entropy, because I think things are just slowly failing in society.
I think one of the sort of key steps is that people have to realize that not everything can be categorized into yes and no, right or wrong, this group good, that group bad. They've got to understand that there's tremendous complexity, even in simple questions. And just because an expert sort of says, well, this is good and that's bad, doesn't mean to say that that's actually the case, and you've got to listen to this expert rather than another expert. The world is an endlessly complex place, and no two particles are exactly the same, because they can't be in the same place at the same time. And so we just have, I think everyone can benefit from realizing that they don't have to take sides on a particular matter. They can just sort of relax and be more accepting of different perspectives, and recognize that trying to find a demon or someone to demonize is not going to solve any problems. It just will not. I mean, it'll just likely make a situation worse. I don't know if you're aware of the work of a fellow called a professor called Matthias Desmet. It sort of ties into what we're talking about here, but at a societal level. He's a professor at Ghent University, and he's on the verge of publishing a book. And I think it's got some fascinating ideas that tie in with your polyvagal theory. It also has some interesting parallels with what magicians do and what happens when there's hypnosis and so on. And he uses that to talk about what's happening at a societal level. And if you're not aware of that, I think it's worth looking into. I can explain a little bit more about it if you're interested.
Yes, I'm very interested. Please, what have you been learning from Matthias Desmet?
Well, I'm going to sort of bastardize what he says a little bit, and sort of use my own language. But he says there's four aspects that go into what he called mass formation. And when he says mass formation, he's sort of talking about a form of mass psychosis that happens across societies. Psychosis is a harsh word, so that's why he uses mass formation. But let's just say mass psychosis for the sake of argument. And that mass psychosis might relate to a sort of a perceived evil, and it arises because of what he calls free-floating anxiety. And I think in the West, particularly actually in the Midwest United States and sort of areas that were previously industrial that have become deindustrialized, there's a lot of insecurity, and particularly with young people who can't necessarily find rewarding blue-collar work. They're either working in a fast food restaurant or, trying to get a job doing some computing thing. But the old ways of earning a living have been changing so massively that it's causing widespread anxiety. In addition to that, you've got this lack of social connectedness. We have social media, but for most people, particularly young people, it actually drives them apart. You're seeing these sort of exaggerated, retouched images of your friends and other people, and rather than sort of bringing people together, it's like, oh my God. And then of course on Facebook you get this massive polarization between different ideas. You're either thumbs up or you're thumbs down, you love it or you hate it. So there's a lack of social connectedness that's been happening over the last number of years, and I think it's now being made like 10 times worse with the pandemic and the shutting down of many schools, remote learning. So you've got those two things: anxiety, free-floating anxiety, lack of social connectedness, plus there's been a breakdown of what you might call ways of sense-making. So 100 years ago, people would go to church, synagogue, temple, whatever, and that would provide some sort of collective way that people could structure their life and sing along together and find sanity together, find togetherness. And that has been breaking down recently. So you've got those three things, and it's now being turned into outrage and aggression against sort of various focal points, whether it's racism or carbon dioxide or unequal distribution of wealth, or people who aren't vaccinated or whatever. And so, these you're getting tribalism that is just sort of running rampant through society. And I mean, if you do a fact check now on mass psychosis, you'll find that I think AP and some of the wire services say it doesn't exist, which also points to an issue, with our ability to quote understand what a fact is and what it isn't. But Matthias Desmet's ideas, I think, help us understand what we're observing around us increasingly these days, with the opioid crisis and depression, and I'm sure all of the things that you're dealing with, which is not part of my world, thankfully, but I would guess it's part of yours.
Yes, I mean, we're seeing, in the microcosm of the treatment room, we see the macro of what's going on in society, kind of how people are reacting to it. And yes, the grand narratives and like you mentioned, like the worship places and coming together and even the community hall or the library, there is a disconnection with people. Mm-hmm. And, we talked about, I think in the last episode, about people in their silos, like the academia, the different parts of academia aren't collaborating for various reasons. There's different silos of thought. And oddly enough, we still have the massive structures in the United States of government, local and regional and federal. And so we're trying to navigate. Those systems are continuing to exist, but other systems, such as, like you said, like maybe a more straightforward job market that was more predictable, a gathering place for people that was more, I guess, socially done and ritualistic and continuous. And even I was thinking about this, people watch Netflix and different things like this, but the only things that people watch together now that I've not the only things, but some of the only things people watch together as a group are sports games and a new episode of something, right? But oftentimes, most people are watching different shows at different times. Where even when television was first coming out, it was a broadcast. You at a certain time you did things. So things are all happening at different times. So there's an onus on the individual to try to make and find, quote unquote, their people or people that they can be around and feel safe around and have conversations around. And I mean safety in the most literal sense, like as in you're not being harmed or abused. That's what I mean by that. I don't mean disagreed with. And it's interesting because all of what you're saying is true. And so it's, for me, what I've seen is it seems like people are lonely and they're trying to find like-minded people, and they're trying to find the time to get together, but they don't often have a common meeting place, right? If you don't, first of all, the younger people are saying, wow, alcohol is pretty unhealthy. Maybe we should just drink tea at like a minimal amount of alcohol or no alcohol. But soda, Coca-Cola is very unhealthy. It's just sugar water with some carbonation. Maybe we should be drinking this carbonated water with no sugar in it. Maybe. And so what I'm saying is, where's the gathering place? Should we go to the bar? And then, as you said, the various churches are breaking up. I could go on about why I think they're dying. I think that they're subject to the same issues that you're seeing in the larger governments and very large businesses, which is they have forgotten their core values and they are trying to somehow manipulate you into giving them money and staying, and it's become a mess. But you're right, there was more predictability before, at least in the recent past. I'm talking about the 20th century. I don't know about before then, probably less predictable, but
well, like way back, I mean, you would have gone to, in England, the local pub or the local gathering place, like the local hall,
a gathering place,
the local
right?
church, or whatever.
And those rhythms are off even worse because of the pandemic. But people want to belong to something. They want a tribe, and you'll even hear the word family, which is who are your friends as a replacement for family. Like your blood relations are supposedly supposed to be nice to you, and you have this nice relationship, but it doesn't always work out that way. That's why we're in business. But where do we belong to? So the onus is really on the individual right now to find or create a community amongst massive breakdowns in older structures that seem to be leading to entropy. And I don't know where that brings us to, except that you really, as a person now, have to be aware of what are you doing? How are you showing up in the world? How are you managing your health? How are you managing your mental health? What impact are you having on those around you? And what type of work do you want to do? I mean, one thing that was interesting to me is this whole work conversation where you keep hearing nobody wants to work. And I don't want to get into what I think about that exactly, except that to say, I think that people are not just resigning work, they're reevaluating what work is and what kind of work they want to do. And I think, especially right now, that the worker has a lot more say over, what they want to do. And part of that, I think, came from the pandemic, all of a sudden realizing they could work from home and be more productive in certain ways. Although I think that leads to another problem, because I think we do need to go to the workplace. So I'm all over the place. I'm speaking out of both sides of my mouth. I don't know what the answer is to this. I just think
I think maybe we can sort of tie this back into the bottom up thing, in that one's mental health and the meaning in one's life is sort of brought about because of one's sort of day-to-day, minute-to-minute interactions with those around one, and the groups one interacts with. And I know in my case, my life has changed massively over the last, who knows? I mean, I'm an old guy now, I'm 65. But it's changed massively over the last, let's say, 20, 25 years, in that I used to, drive to work. I used to have a large team of people. I used to drive to see clients. And that doesn't happen anymore. I now get a lot of enjoyment from. I have to say, I continue to get a lot of enjoyment from playing sports with people. I love playing tennis, and that I think is very stabilizing. Just sort of being on a court together. You don't necessarily need to talk with each other, but just the physical presence of others, and if you're playing doubles, working together and having fun is meaningful. But I get a massive amount of enjoyment now from having online get-togethers with groups of people, and that's something that I just absolutely never considered doing even 2 years ago. But now, twice a week or more, I get together with sort of meta sense-making groups and of one sort or another. And there's spaces where we can talk about controversial matters openly, and we're very tolerant of different ways of looking at the world. And I find that I derive a lot of stability from that, because I have to confess, even in my household here with my wife, I find it very difficult to talk about, for instance, vaccines or political matters. We don't see things the same way, and so I have to find other groups that enable me to express myself openly, and I think in many years gone by, that wasn't necessary, because one would have been getting together with people at the local diner or at the local hall or church or local organizations that have, to a large degree, disappeared now.
Yes, it's a strange world out there. I think we're right now in the process of adapting in multiple ways at once, which I think is quite confusing. We're adapting to more online if there's less availability of institutions or organizations or cafes out there to all meet in. And at the same time, I also see there's a draw, and I don't know if you've seen this as much, but as the restrictions let up in terms of lockdowns in where I was in Michigan for most of the year, people were just aching to get in close quarters again with each other, concerts and things like that. And the demand for, I know that online therapy is, of course, burgeoning industry, but people really, really wanted the in-person if possible, as long as they weren't feeling at risk. They just wanted to come in. I mean, we got more calls every day. The first starting in June was, do you do in-person counseling? That's the first thing they asked. Yes, we do. Oh, yeah. So I feel like, while it says that postmodern weird situation we're in, because we've now, I do most of my interviews over Zoom like this, but at the same time, people are craving that intimacy or that co-regulation or that community feeling of being around others as well. And I think, I'm not going to say the number one factor, but one of the major factors I think that hurt people's mental health was the isolation. Isolation seems to make everything worse, because Absolutely. We're pod animals. We're pod animals. We need other animals to help us regulate. People adopted cats and dogs and all sorts of pets during the pandemic to help them regulate their system.
This takes us back to sort of this whole bottom-up sort of biology way of looking at the world. We have tended in the academic world to view communication as words written and spoken, but if you recognize that the mechanisms that are at work in our neural systems have been in play for 70, 100, 200 million years. Pick a spot, but certainly amongst sort of mammals, for tens of millions of years, not hundreds. Those mechanisms don't work with words. They work with sort of physical presence. smell and physical presence, and that's why there's this hollowness in people's lives when they're not physically getting together. I mean, certainly, I think it's true that for nearly everyone, actual physical touch is important, and you know, if you're single and you never touch anyone, or you're living alone and you never touch anyone, there's something missing. We need physical touch, and it's tremendously therapeutic, and there's a lack of acknowledgement that that's a legitimate need, in my view, and of course that sort of plays into the whole realm of sexual health. I mean, that is such an important aspect of stable relationships in many cases.
Yes, I think the field of psychology will agree with you. So if you start reading stuff from our field, we're all about physical touch, proximity, sexual health. If those factors aren't there, they're similar to having a slow killing disease. I mean, a slow working disease. If you're unhealthy in any category, we call it biopsychosocial, sexual, spiritual aspect, because we see meaning. For humans, meaning is very important, and having that meaning. And so I think a lot of people are suffering right now. You know, it's interesting you say that, but like, think about this. I've heard people say this to me, and have seen it in the movies, that one of the most romantic beginnings of something is the two things: either looking into someone's eyes and not saying anything, and knowing something implicit or feeling something implicit, or holding someone's hand. And but unless we're climbing a bridge at like some sort of climbing park, there's not really that many reasons logically to hold someone's hand other than we need it, right? And why would I rather, if given the choice today? I'm in Arizona right now, so it's nice outside, and so if I so choose, I can go to an outdoor cafe or whatever and see a friend, and even if they had some sort of sickness, I could sit 6 feet away from them, whatever. You know, that I don't want to get into that whole line of thinking. But what I'm saying is, I have the opportunity. If they said, "Hey, do you want to have coffee today on Zoom, or do you want to meet up at this cafe over here?" I'd say, "Well, of course I want to meet you at the cafe," because there's so much richness in just being in someone's presence. And if you had said to me, "Tom, you're in Toronto and I'm in Arizona right now. Hey, do you want to do this podcast over the phone and just record it?" I would say, no. I want to I want a video. I want to look at you. I want to see your body language. And even though I'm a person who must have those little fidget things around because I have a lot of excess energy when I sit, and you might, have noticed that. I really do enjoy seeing, your face and your reactions, because that gives me so much more information and inspires me more than if I just heard your voice on the telephone.
Absolutely. I wish when I was young, I had known more about the importance of being with people, and also knowing that talking isn't about looking smart or trying to say something that's sort of super intelligent. Just sort of small talk is therapeutic, and just sort of learning to use words in the same way. I learned a new word just now, family. I've never heard of that. I wanted to pretend that I knew it all along, but discovering words and using them in new ways is part of what helps bring people together. And I think if I'd been taught that, I think I would have been more successful, let's say, in business. I mean, I've got nothing to complain about. But I wish I'd known that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm glad it's very nice to hear you talk about, your personal revelations from this. And I would say, I mean, I'm younger than you, but I'm still learning that. I mean, I was taught the exact opposite. I was taught that, it's about what you say, not as much as what you say it. It's about what you believe, less about what you do. I mean, these are the institutions I was raised in, and I was like, go off to university, and it's a little bit, it's not as bad because they tell you, live by the syllabus, and it's a little bit more your responsibility. But still the idea was who knows the most is the best, and not who lives the best way might, and then shares that might actually be, I'm not trying to rank, but possibly better for the species.
Yeah. And who listens better? I mean, in certain segments, Joe Rogan is vilified. But two things you notice about Joe Rogan: he's very good at listening and hearing what people say, which is very unusual. And also, as far as I'm aware, he doesn't lie. He's forthright, and it doesn't take a whole lot of going to school to learn those things. If you appreciate the value of listening, it can enrich every relationship, in my view. And of course, like, trying not to lie is, or at least trying to be honest, helps bring people together.
I agree. And it's these, I love that we're kind of ending on this bottom up. It's these little things we can work on in ourselves and with those around us. And okay, the other day I had this discussion with my wife. We were walking around here at night with our dog, and we were talking about the news and how she said something about the news. And I said, "Oh gosh, I don't want to hear that. Can we wait till Friday? That's my news reading day." And then I said, "Wait a minute." And that's not totally true, but I try to not read it every day. And I said, what if, and this is of course a fantasy, I said, what if we could control, and we, at all of the news channels, unless there was an earthquake, or a fire or a military attack, that all the news people went on like a nice little vacation and got to write these like longer stories. And all of the public, it was just blackness on the TV. You turn on CNN, black. Fox News, black. MSNBC, black. There was nothing. Like, we'll be back on Friday at 3 p.m., right? And we're like, what's going on? It's like, don't worry. If there's a hurricane, a weather event, or a military attack, we'll let you know. And I said, I wonder how people's mental health would be if they could only consume the news 1 or 2 days a week. And that the news anchors themselves got some rest, because, they're caking on makeup because they've never slept, in years. And they're just, keyed up and upset and frustrated about everything they're hearing that's terrible. And they get to do one pet story a week, and the rest of it was just whatever. And of course it's a total fantasy, but you think about.
But you say it's a fantasy. And of course it is a fantasy that the folks at CNN and New York Times and MSNBC and BBC and so on, they're not going to go away for 6 days a week.
No.
But in my case, I used to be a voracious consumer of news. I used to read the newspaper from front to back every day, and I used to watch the evening news, and I had the radio on, listen to the news. I loved the news, and I appreciated knowing what was going on. I have to make a confession. Over the last 2 years, I have not watched the news once. I have not switched on the TV in the last 2 years. From the time I started writing my book, which was 2 years ago, I just don't do it. I don't have it on a TV screen. Let's say in the kitchen, with the feed along the bottom. I never look at it. What I do is I get my news from newsletters and Substack, and I subscribe to people who actually think deeply about subjects, rather than the dribble that we're fed every day, which is, on the whole, really poorly thought out and highly superficial. And most of the news these days, unfortunately, is just a regurgitation of press releases from government and politicians and companies. So, or someone's reporting on what they've seen on their Twitter feed. It has, in my view, it has no value at all. and I think it's one of the reasons I'm feeling fairly good about life, and I would recommend it to everyone.
I actually think that's a great idea. Yeah. I mean, I've always joked that I've taken major news fast, and I don't watch the news. I only read articles here or there that seem to be a little bit longer in duration. But I always joked about this. I said, if for some reason I needed to know what was going on, I'm sure the local government would interact with my iPhone and send me some sort of buzzing alert, and or everyone I know would call me. So it's all, that's the best part about knowing people, is they will tell you, oh my gosh, be careful. There's a UFO above your apartment. It's, it's.
Well, yeah. Or you just feel the earthquake. You think, oh, okay, well, there's an earthquake. I need to do something about that.
Right. Or there is an earthquake. I feel it. Or there's a fire. I see it. Right. So it's like, that's an interesting part about this, and hearing about the news and what you said. And I always just call it the bad news. It's mostly just bad news, and like what you said, press releases. And I've been in the whole thing where, they call you and they say, oh, we really enjoy counseling. We'd like to give you a segment on our show. I said, oh, really? Okay. I'd love to come on and talk for half an hour. Oh, no, it's 2 minutes. Oh, and it's $500. Wait, what? What is that, pay to play? So now recently I was interviewed by a local news station. They gave me 4 minutes and it was free, and it was to help the public. It was because of the mental health thing. That was nice. But again, it was a short, it was very, like you said, superficial. I couldn't explain what we do in 4 minutes, but I tried. So anyway, with that being said, I think for people that want to delve deeper into how things work, different ways to view the world, expanding your horizons, I have to say I've read most of your book. I'm still in the last few chapters because it's a really rich book, a really, really rich book, and I love it.
Thank you.
But it is definitely like one of those books where you almost want to read a chapter twice. But I recommend it to people. So How to Understand Everything, Consilience, A New Way to See the World by Tom Beakbane. And then, and I mean, sounds like you're open to people contacting you, and
I love it when people send me emails and we get on Twitter Spaces or Clubhouse. I really appreciate when people want to discuss the ideas. I really love it when some of the ideas actually help people figure out their aspects of their job or their life. And I mean, I did write the book because I think if we understand ourselves better as human beings, as biological creatures, we're more likely to end up in a good place, building a society that our kids are going to thrive in. I think that many of the trends that are occurring in society right now are taking us in the wrong direction, and our children are not going to be as lucky as, let's say, I was growing up. And so I've written the book with a view that we need to be more truthful about our own selves and the way our neural systems work. We're not nearly as smart as we think we are. So while the book is called How to Understand Everything, it's really about, to use a long word, epistemological humility. It's about humility about what we know and about how much we don't know.
And that is the key point. I think one of the keys to my personal philosophy is understanding how little I know. And when somebody asks me a question, I could give them information, but there's so much I don't know, and I'm willing to learn, and I want to learn, and there's so many different ways and things to learn. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. And I think humility is well needed in this day and age. And so I think it starts right now with anyone listening to this podcast, starts with you. And I think learning new things and learning new ways of approaching the world will help. And I've certainly benefited from talking with you, Tom, and also, reading your book. And I appreciate your contribution.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's been fun.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast with Paul Krauss. I very much have enjoyed my dialogues with Tom Beakbane. He has a very interesting way of looking at the world, and I believe he likes to look at so many different perspectives. It's very refreshing. So I really encourage you to check out his book. It was just a tremendous book, one of the most surprising books I've read in a while. As I mentioned earlier, I am now a full EMDR International Association consultant, and I can provide the training post your EMDR training, about 20 hours on your way to become EMDRIA certified. You can join a group online, or we could talk about individual appointments as well. If you're enjoying this show, please share it with people you know. I would surely appreciate it, or leave us a rating on iTunes. If you want to get trained in EMDR therapy and you're looking for some great advanced trainings, check out EMDR Training Solutions and register today. I have a link in the show notes, and they have given me a code, the word intentional, and if you use that at checkout, you will get $100 off of their cost. They are one of the most affordable trainings on the market, and in fact, I know a lot of the people that have worked for them, and they are fantastic trainers. I highly recommend them. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in Grand Rapids at the Health for Life Grand Rapids and Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting our website, www.healthforlifegr.com. You can also participate in telehealth therapy if that is what you were looking for, if you are in the state of Michigan. You can also give our front desk a call at 616-200-4433. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon literature and their experience in their respective fields, these should not be viewed as the definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you are in a crisis, please dial 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Line at 1-800-273-8255. Are you a young person of color feeling down, stressed out, or overwhelmed? Text the word STEVE, that's STEVE, to 741741, and a live, trained crisis counselor will respond. Did you know you could support your local bookstore by shopping at www.bookshop.org? You can order online from the comfort of your home while knowing that a portion of the proceeds support local brick-and-mortar bookstores in your area. And bookstores are a very important part of any community, as there's a lot of great events that can happen there. If you are a counselor and you are not a member of a professional association, I highly recommend it. Two of the organizations that I'm a member of are the Michigan Mental Health Counselors Association and the Arizona Counselors Association, as well as the national organizations. In this time of political uncertainty and in this time of stress, more and more people are needing mental health coverage, and quite frankly, we don't have enough excellent counselors who are trained, and a lot of therapists can't even take Medicare due to archaic laws from the 1970s. So please write your senators to have licensed professional counselors be able to take Medicare to help our seniors. And please just get involved. It's so easy to just think somebody else is going to do it. But if everybody thinks that, then nothing gets done, or certain people's agendas get done that most of us won't be pleased with. All right, thanks for listening. Take care now and have a safe and peaceful week.
tic, tic.